Hey friends! A number of you have asked about the Book of Common Prayer, so I'm putting together a few videos to talk about what it is, why it exists, what's in it, and how to use it. So this is the first one. So I just want to introduce briefly the background of the Book of Common Prayer, how it came to exist, and why. So the super summary short version is a quick sweep of history. So within about 150 years of Jesus' death and resurrection, they were already Christians in England. The gospel had spread all the way to England, and that there were various forms of faith in England. And then over time, as Rome became more and more central to the church, missionaries were sent from Rome to England, and so the sort of native forms of English worship became more and more what we would now consider kind of traditionally Catholic, as the Roman Catholic Church became more prominent in Europe as sort of the central common form of the church. So England was very Catholic, just like the rest of Europe, until about the 1500s when the Reformation happened. So Martin Luther, 1517, and thereafter there was this Protestant Reformation in Europe, as many of you probably know from your history classes. And as that hit England, Henry VIII, who wanted to get divorces, and the Catholic Church wouldn't let him, and so he separated from the Catholic Church and began what's called the Anglican Church, which ended up kind of being a compromise between Catholic forms of worship and Protestant forms of worship. In typical English way, they were slow and steady rather than having a lot of conflict and ending up on one side or the other. They kind of took the middle road. But of course, there were still a lot of wars and a lot of really difficult things that happened between Catholics and Protestants. So in the middle of all those conflicts in the 1500s, there was a man named Archbishop Cranmer. And he and some other people pulled together 4 different books that were used in the Catholic Church. There was one that guided how to do a service of Mass. There were some that talked about how to pray. There were some that talked about ordination for priests. And they pulled together all of these into a single book and changed it somewhat to make it a little bit more Protestant, and put it into English rather than Latin. And that was the very first Book of Common Prayer. It was the mid-1500s. It changed a lot in the first 10 to 15 years of its existence, but it was the first common book in that lay people and priests could have access to the same book. They didn't have separate books. And also priests all over England then had this common book in English that included all of the services they needed. So it has everything from daily prayer to Sunday worship, to specific services for ordination, to a calendar of which scripture readings to pray when. How do you know when holy days are? Like Christmas is always December 25th, but Easter changes from year to year. So how do you figure out when Easter is? So there are a variety of things in that book that were very helpful, both for priests and for lay people. As you probably also know, the printing press had been invented not long before that, and so people were beginning to collect books, beginning to read, more common. Reading was more common. And so not everybody yet was educated, not everybody could read. And so the Book of Common Prayer also provided a way to give kind of a basic theological guide, both to lay people and to priests, so that they were praying biblical prayers, so that the worship services would include things that were important theologically and not just whatever they happened to want. And if you know a little bit about England as well, you may know that there was a time period in England when wealthy landowners, their oldest son would inherit the land. And there was kind of a joke that then the second son would become the local clergy person, and the third son didn't have anything left to do, so he would go to America. But what that story serves to point out is the fact that some people became clergy because it was kind of tradition or part of the culture, or they became clergy because they didn't have another job to do. It doesn't mean they weren't called by God or that they didn't care about the people or love the Lord, but that being a clergy person wasn't the way we think about it now, that someone was called and then went to seminary and then was called by a congregation. It was often a local person who God had particularly gifted to be a spiritual leader or to be pastoral care person in the community, and he would be the leader of the local church and may or may not have been to any kind of training. And so the Book of Common Prayer would teach him how to lead the services on Sundays, and also sometimes the catechism was included in it, so he could use the catechism to train his people in the congregation. what the gospel was and what the Bible was and what the church believed. So long story short, the Book of Common Prayer came together as a single unified book to guide the worship of the clergy and the lay people all across England. And of course, over time, as the English Empire spread, the Anglican Church spread around the world, and it has become a common book around the world. And there are, over the years, there have been updates and variations to it. So there's, for example, there's a Book of Common Prayer from 2019 that the Anglican Church produced after it left the Episcopal Church and reformed a North American province. And so over the years, as things change within the church, there are different versions of the Book of Common Prayer. 1662 is a famous one. And so people may like one or another version better or worse because of the way the language sounds from that particular time period, or because they grew up with it and they love that particular version and they know where to find everything in it. And then there are also variations to the Book of Common Prayer, sometimes in other parts of the world, where the Anglican Church spread, and over time, the native people who weren't coming in as missionaries, but who lived there and grew up there, adopted the Anglican service, but modified it some to fit their own culture and ways of doing things. So, yeah, there are a lot of different books of common prayer around the world. So being able to say, this is from the 2019 Book of Common Prayer, or whichever year it's from, sometimes you'll hear that to distinguish one book from another one, one version from another version. So our current Book of Common Prayer in the Anglican Church is the ACNA BCP, Book of Common Prayer, from 2019. And you can get a copy online. We have copies for those who get confirmed or baptized in our church. And I think also received in our church. And my next video will tell you a little bit about what's in it, and then we'll talk more about how to use it. So one other place to look, you can get a PDF of it online. Just look it up, 2019 ACNA BCP. It's a very long PDF, so it takes up a little space on your computer, but you can look that up if you want. And then there's also an app, Daily Office 2019. If you can get the app, or you can go to the website, Daily Office 2019. It's got a little picture, it's like a red with a Jerusalem cross, the gold cross with the 4 little crosses in the corners. And that is a way to do the Book of Common Prayer either online or on your phone. And what they do is they just have morning prayer, midday prayer, evening prayer, and compline, just the daily prayers that each of us can pray during the day on that app. So if you want to look at any of those things before we talk again, that'd be great. Glance through it, look at the table of contents, or just scroll through and see what's there. All right, I'll talk to you again soon.